So great. Hey, this is a huge week for me. It's a dream come true in many ways, feeling like closing the loop. I would say when I started Mythological Africans, which some of you might be familiar with, I had hoped that this might be something that would happen, but I can't say I thought it would happen as fast as it did. And if it did, I think that speaks to the interest that you all have in stories from the African continent and just the enthusiasm with which you've received the effort that I've put into the platform. So once again, thank you all so much. And the book, it came into being. Watkins reached out and they had the vision, and thankfully, we were able to meet each other on the path and take it all the way through to completion. And so, if you don't yet have a copy, I'll give a quick overview of what it's about, and then we'll read one short piece of it, and then I'll open up the forum for any questions that anyone might have. And so the Watkins Book of African Folklore is a collection of folk tales and myths from the African continent. It has three sections. One focused on creation myths and foundation legends, one focused on stories of human relationships and some of the institutions that those relationships are created, and one focused on animal tales. And there's a reason why I broke the book down in this way, mainly because the creation myths and foundation legends section talks about how different people from across the African continent imagined the world came to be. And that section was very fun to write because growing up, for example, I only really knew the Genesis story. That was the only creation myth that I knew. And so getting this perspective on how different people from across the continent came to how they thought the world came into being has been very interesting. And it might seem like a small thing on the surface, but I believe personally that your understanding of how the world came to be really does influence the way you move through the world. And one of the things you'll find in many of the foundation legends, I can think of at least two that I include in the book, is that they form the basis of relationships between people. So the foundation legend from the Amazi, people who are found mostly in northern Africa, and the foundation legend from the Bayaka, people who are sometimes referred to as the Benjele, but I came to find out that Benjele actually means a child. But that's a term that's used for them. But those two foundation legends have quite a bit in common. They start out with men and women coming into being and living separately, and then they find their way to each other, and then they have to navigate to a sort of balance, how to coexist. And in one instance, the patriarchy wins, and women kind of take a subordinate position. That's the Amazi version, probably influenced a little bit by Islamic thought. And then there is the Bayaka version, which comes from Central Africa, the forest people. And in that version, they navigate themselves to a balance, an egalitarian type setup where, as it's playing out today, an elaborate network of relationships and obligations that make sure that no one group overpowers the other. And that's of course changing with, how lifestyles have changed. Forest people are in many ways disempowered, dispossessed of the land and the forest that they claim as their homes, and that's having an implication. However, that core sense of okay, we have rights and responsibilities holds true. So that has been fascinating to discover, and I'm glad that I get to share. Especially the Amaze story, because how that story even came to the public has a great backstory. Like it blew my mind. So that was really fun to get to know, but also just other stories about how the world literally was created, the creator beings. You might be curious why, for so many African people, the most powerful entities live in the sky, and how that happened and why that happened and the role that women played in all of that. So that whole section was just a delight to write. And then moving into the human relationships and institutions section, there is a lot there. It actually, that section came about because I read a story about how nephews, because in some West African cultures, a person's nephews are who inherit his property after he passes, not his sons or his daughters. And there is a whole backstory to why that came to be. But then the backstory that's in circulation as the popular version has its own backstory. So part of this book was looking at the folktale, saying, okay, this is the story, but how did this story evolve to its current form? What made it change? How has it changed? Who first documented it, and all of that. So that was really fun to write, but also just bringing in stories from parts of the continent that you probably have to go to these places to find some of these stories. For example, Mauritania. I I made a point to include stories from different parts of the continent, north, south, east, west, central. I actually broke that down and tried to make sure that there were stories from each of these parts. And so finding a story from Mauritania, which speaks to history, but also speaks to current events, current pressing social justice issues in the country, that was a delight to do. And so the book was as much an education for me, an enlightenment for me, getting to know the continent that I'm from. Because believe it or not, I grew up listening to folk tales for sure, but not in any deep, like the amount of value and understanding I've had about African people from curating mythological Africans and writing this book has certainly opened a whole new world to me. And so we have that section on human relationships, understanding why things are set up the way they are now, and hopefully that would inspire changes in the future. And then there's a section on animal tales, which I think anywhere you go in the world, if you're looking at mythology and folklore, then the animal tales will be a big part of it. But for that section, my intention was to focus not just on the animals that are standard to African folklore. You have the hare, you have the tortoise, you have the spider, lions and elephants, and leopards and antelopes, the giraffes, the animals that are common, ostriches, for example. But to really see who else is out there, and that part was fun because I got to discover some creatures which are my absolute favorites now, like the hedgehog. I really wasn't expecting that, but it is huge in northern African mythology. And so there's a whole section dedicated to hedgehog fables and an analysis of that. And if you look at the cover of the book, you probably get a sense of one of the animals that also feature in there. And if you read the Mythological Africans newsletter, you probably have read about why I made snakes such a huge focus, a huge part of the book. And that's because I believe that because of the way Christian philosophy has filtered into the continent because of the biblical serpent, there is a lot of misconceptions about the role that snakes play in African mythology. And so this was an effort to say, hey, it's not to say that the snake is not a dangerous animal. It's not to say that there are not negative characteristics associated with it as a folkloric creature. It's to say there is so much more. And in that sense, to also offer African mythology and folklore as something which is so much more, because if you've read into the history of mythology and folklore from the continent, one of the things you'll find out is that people were actually shocked to find out that there was even mythology and folklore on the African continent, which I think is hilarious because if you know anything about us Africans, we are yappers, as the kids say these days. We love to talk, we love to tell stories. And so just it blew my mind even to find out that there are people out there who didn't think that there was valid mythology and folklore from the African continent. And so this book and everything I do with mythological Africans is an effort to offer that, to say, hey, this is something you might be interested in, probably should be, to get an understanding, a full understanding of what it means to be human. And so the book came together the best that I could put it. I am really, really proud of it. I will read a story here in a bit, but I am hoping that as you receive it, as you read it, you learn something new about African people through the stories and what they say about humanity, that you learn something new about yourself, and that you are able to just appreciate the gorgeous, gorgeous book, because this is one of my favorite things about the book, just how beautiful the cover does. And I have the folks over at Watkins Publishing to thank for that, and Alice, who designed the cover, is just she outdid herself here. And so I will stop yapping for a bit, and we will read a story from the book. Um, let me see. Which one should we read? I think we can do one of the stories about the origins of death. And I would say this section was important to me to create, to include, because life and death go together, right? You can't have life without death. And so getting an overview of how different African peoples conceived the idea of death coming into the world was really interesting. And to see some of the commonalities in the stories was helpful, because it makes you stop and think about how stories travel, and how, depending on the place and time and what people have going on, the stories might change to reflect that reality. So from page 42, we'll do 5 accounts of the origins of death. Number one from the Kikuyu people in Kenya. In the beginning of all things, all people of the earth were immortal. They lived with their families, generation adding to generation. But as time passed, the people began to worry. Around them, they witnessed the cycle of life as animals and plants died, never to return, and new ones were born. Will this become our fate too? They asked anxiously amongst themselves, wanting to reassure. They asked amongst themselves. The great Creator guy, I'm sorry, my cat wants to be part of this. The great Creator guy observed their worry from the top of Kilimanjaro, wanting to reassure them. He sent Chameleon to assure the people of the earth that they would never die. Chameleon took off on the journey to the people, walking slowly, as is his manner, repeating the message to himself so he would not forget. Chameleon had not been gone very long when Guy changed his mind. He saw that if humans didn't join the cycle of life and death, things would quickly become unbalanced on Earth, and so he summoned a bird to him. Go quickly, Guy commanded the bird. Go and proclaim to the people of Earth that they too shall die and never return. The bird flew quickly and arrived on the earth just as Chameleon, who had arrived at the village a few moments earlier, began to speak. But Chameleon was nervous and tired, so he stammered. Great Guy has, Great Guy has, And without hesitating, the bird proclaimed the message he had been sent with. Great Guy has heard your anxious questions and has sent me to tell you that yes, indeed, all people shall die and never return. Chameleon had stammered too long and failed to announce his message. That is why all men must die. And so with this story, I would, first of all, I'm very interested to hear what your thoughts are about it. This is something that we would do on the Mythological Africans Twitter Spaces, where we would have a conversation and just find out. So if you have any thoughts about the story, go ahead and put it in the chat and we can take a look at them. But something that really gets to me is you have to imagine what it was like for the first humans to realize that death was a thing, and if you think about human evolution and how people lived, death was a very real daily threat, either from encounters with wild animals or some kind of injury or picking up a disease, bacteria, virus, something which you didn't have a cure for. And so just that realization that there is an end, I imagine it was shocking, and people came up with all these stories to explain and understand it. And there are, as it stands, hundreds of versions of this story across the African continent, different variations on the same theme. The animals will differ. There are some animals that show up fairly often. A bird, for example, across the continent are considered divine messengers, and across the world, that's a common thing you will find in the mythology of different peoples. And so quite often you'll find that the bird is the creature that carries the message. Sometimes the bird carries the bad news, sometimes the bird carries the good news. Chameleons as well are considered divine messengers. I believe in Yoruba mythology specifically, The chameleon is a messenger of the high god, and so you'll find chameleons in different parts of the continent being the carrier of messages. But there are also dogs and ducks and goats, which there's another story in the book that focuses on goats in particular as a messenger of the divine and ties into why goats tend to be sacrificial animals. And there's another section on birds and their role as divine messengers. So something I tried to do with the book was link stories, link themes across place and time. That way I could give a full perspective of just what stories mean, because if we use stories to make sense of the world, to make sense of our lives, then you can expect to find some of these intersections across place, across time. And so I will slow down and maybe see we have a question in the chat. And if you have any questions or comments or thoughts that you want to share, more than happy to hear them and talk about them. Otelia, thank you so much. And your question is if there are archetypes in African folklore, and if so, do they have correspondences with the Jungian archetypes? I would say definitely yes. The great thing about the Jungian archetypes, and that's, regardless of what you feel about them, I know there are some people who have their critiques of the Jungian archetypes, but what they offer are these overarching accumulations of what humanity means, whether you're looking at them in their positive or in their negative sense. And so take the kingly archetype, for example, that cuts across place and time. There are characteristics that good kings are supposed to embody. And so you will find them. For example, one of the most famous royal figures on the African continent is Sundiata Keita. And in the positive sense, the king archetype is supposed to be heroic, is supposed to be noble, is supposed to be powerful, but also humble. And in the accounts about Sundiata Keita, you find that to be the case. Now, we can have a conversation about who documented Sundiata Keita and the motives they might have had to present him in the way they did. Of course, his great rival was Sumanguro Kante, who was characterized as a sorcerer king. But then if you look at it from the perspective of the people who saw Sundiata spread, and Sundiata spread came with Islam, if you look at it from the perspective who saw that as something negative, then suddenly Sundiata's embodiment of the kingly archetype gets flipped on his head, and Sumanguro is the one who gets, the face of the king who was noble and good and tried to fight for his people. So it varies. Another archetype you see in the Jungian framework is that of the maiden, right? The young woman who goes on some adventure, and that maiden type archetype will play out in different ways, either as a princess or as an innocent maiden or someone who has different understanding of the world around her and is empowered in different ways. And you get a lot of that on the African continent. Matter of fact, one of the stories in the book is about a princess who goes on a journey because of the situation at home with her father. So I would say absolutely, because archetypes speak to the human experience. You will, if you want to find them, you will find Jungian type archetypes in folklore, in African folklore. Now, does that mean that the African people out of whom these stories emerged would necessarily think of them that way? I can't say exactly yes or no, but I believe that we tell ourselves stories for a reason. We tell ourselves stories because we want to capture the essence of what we think is important and should be valued and preserved, and also highlight what we should be mindful of, what we should avoid. And so I think it drills down to essentially the same thing. If you want to call it an archetype, absolutely fine, but I'm sure if you look at the storytelling traditions and the terminology, you'll probably find a word or something that alludes to the idea of an archetype. So I hope that answers your question, Ottilia. The issue of archetypes, I think, is is very complex. It can get very complex, especially if you get hung up on where it's coming from and who created these frameworks and what they intended to achieve with these frameworks. But if you just look at them from a plain, is this a thing? I think it cuts through a lot of the noise and makes things quite straightforward. So thank you. I appreciate you asking the question. And if you don't know much about African folklore, this is an opportunity I hope to learn more. And the great thing that I appreciate about how this book came together is that it's a book of stories, it's commentary, but it's also bibliography. So if you don't know about African folklore, check out the bibliography at the end. There are references to every book that I consulted, every research paper. There is a trace to the analysis and everything. So hopefully, after you read the book, you can speak with a bit more confidence about African folklore. Thank you. Thank you. I think it's all three. And thank you for that question. That's a really important question because myself, I came to curating mythological Africans out of a desire to understand what do I have going on? Because I am very much into self-help and spirituality and psychology. And if you read many of these books, they reference archetypes, as Otilia was asking, from Greek folklore, from Roman folklore, from Celtic folklore, from Native American folklore, Hinduism, Buddhism, there is folklore from just about the Aztecs, there is mythology and folklore from just about everyone. And African folklore is right there. Massive body of literature, a lot of it carried over to the Americas by the unfortunate occurrence of the slave trade. And yet, a lot of the times you'll find that unless you go to very specific sources, there's almost no reference to African folklore. Or if there's a reference, it is to Anansi, which all credit to Anansi. He is a gigantic figure in African folklore, but he's not the only trickster figure. Or there's reference to the Orisas, which again, when you think about the slave trade, makes perfect sense. But there was spirituality and gods and goddesses and spirits and ancestral spirits from all over the continent. So I think that we have a group of people who, because of their interest and participation in traditional African spirituality, have kept a body of knowledge alive, and all thanks to them, because a lot might have been lost otherwise. But then also in scholarly circles, you have people who study African folklore. And so it kind of remained a niche a topic for many people until the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years when one, because here in the US, we carry the big heads of driving a lot of popular culture, with social media blowing everything open and the reality of the lives of Black people here in the US coming to the forefront, social media and the internet also penetrating the African continent, and you have people who have a platform which they didn't have before, and then suddenly the narrative arrives. So yes, we have Christianity, we have Islam, we have globalization. Well, what is underneath all of that? And so it doesn't surprise me to hear that there's been a resurgence of interest, because there is the baseline that has always been the people who are into it for spiritual reasons, the people who are into it for academic research reasons. But recently it has hit pop culture, and very good too, because I think it's a good thing. I think that if people have clarity about where they come from, and mythology, I just saw a quote this morning that mythology is not prehistory. It's an ongoing commentary on life as it is. And the story will twist and turn and change, but it's literally an ongoing commentary on life as we're experiencing it. And so now is about the right time for this to happen, because everything is changing so fast. With technology, our understanding of what it means to be human is changing. And that change is inevitable. But I think of it as a spiral, right? And it can spiral up, it can spiral down, it can spiral left, it can spiral right. And sometimes we need the stories of past turns of that spiral to help us understand what is going on right now and what could happen if we don't course correct just a little bit. So I'm thrilled to hear of the interest. I'm glad to have something to contribute. There are a lot of amazing books about mythology and folklore. As a matter of fact, a book just dropped, an anthology of Anansi tales from people across the African diaspora, commentary on Anansi stories, and so it's an ongoing field. It's an ever evolving field. I'm just happy to have something to contribute to it. I would say the by and large the trickster tales, because they really illustrate what is important to African people, especially in the context of change. One of the things you'll find about African tricksters is that they fall into two broad categories: those who just want to do the least amount of work for the most amount of gain, and those who just want to get by, who want to be in peace, who want to live in harmony and give as good as they get. And one is usually used as a cautionary tale to say, hey, if you don't want to hold up your end of things, if you don't want to put in the work with everybody else, then you are taking more than you deserve. And there are, and Nancy tends to be one of those kind of tricksters who, tries to cut corners. But the other face of that is a trickster who is used as an instrument of justice sometimes to authority figures. And the purpose of these tales is to create a sense of balance, to say, hey, you put in the work you need to put in, but you also don't get taken advantage of. If your cunning can go one way or another, either to take advantage of others or to make sure that you don't get taken advantage of. And so reading those stories, especially as a woman, as a Black woman navigating the world and all its challenges, it has been very empowering for me to see that there are figures out there that understood complexity, but also provided a way to be in the world that you're not letting yourself be taken advantage of, but you also have an eye on what matters. Because what you'll find is that in the stories, the tricksters that want to just do what they can and get along and have enough, when in their encounters with these more powerful figures, the storytellers use what is essential about these creatures' beings. An example is the royal antelope, who is a trickster from the Mende people of Sierra Leone. And the royal antelopes are tiny, 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 like tiny antelopes. They're an antelope, but they're really tiny, to the point where people at first thought they were just tiny rabbits, but they're not. But then that size, that small size, is an advantage that they have, because they use that to navigate situations with. I mean, there is a story in the book of an antelope outsmarting an elephant and a hippopotamus. Now you can imagine this was a tug of war. This was a story, tug of war, but somehow this antelope got the best of an elephant and a hippopotamus. And so there is that sense of, hey, you could be this tiny, tiny thing in this big, big world, and so much is out of your control. But there are ways you can get by if you stay true to who you are and you always try to put the best of yourself out there. There are ways you can navigate, and you will reap the benefits of a life well lived if you hold true to that. So definitely that, but also you'll find that in many of the stories about girls, there's, from what I could see, there are not a whole lot of damsels in distress in African folklore. Um, the capacity to move through life looking at things and having an understanding of how you can navigate. It might seem for a while that you're in a disadvantaged position, but if you have clarity about where you want to end up, and you have an awareness of what's important to your community, you can always find your footing, no matter what it looks like on the outside. So that has been a lot to process, and part of why I started on this journey to begin with, because there are a lot of stories from all over the world that are inspiring, that offer the same lessons, but it's been really good to have them from cultures which I feel a sense of ownership and participation with. That is another great question. And if you look at social and cultural commentary from the African continent, one thing you understand is just how well people understood the principle of complementarity. So Yes, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. They're fundamentally different from each other in many ways, but under the right circumstances, with the right understanding, they can work together to create a society worth living in. And I think that's what a lot of these stories where men start off in some corner, women are in some corner, and then they meet and then they battle it out and then arrive at some kind of resolution. Now, the nature of that resolution depends on the storyteller and when they're telling the story. But I think the idea behind it is that it is well understood that men and women are not the same beings. We move through the world differently. We understand the world differently, and sometimes there is friction, sometimes there is conflict, but there's also the possibility for harmony. There's also the possibility for understanding and complementing each other in good ways. So I think that's what is really behind a lot of these stories, because when you look at how that translates into community life, a lot of the times you would find that men had their domain, women had their domain, and there was intersection in how there was a level of intersection which is how the community came to understand each other. So a lot of times you have organizations for men, but they would have a woman in a key position in this organization. They'll have organizations for women, and they'll have a man in a key position. And this was to make sure that voices were heard. Now, time changed all of that. Colonialism changed a lot of that. Climate changes. If you think about just the desertification of the Sahara was, trees and savanna and fertile at one time, and it started changing and people migrated. The slave trade changed a lot of that, because if you have a situation where your people are being hunted and you have to move, you have to navigate, what is needed for the community to function is fundamentally affected. And so you have all these influences, and they would have different impact on the dynamics of the relationships. But I think underneath all of that, when you look at how these stories came to be, they tell you that there was a very, very clear understanding of how people stand in society and how that might work for good or for not so good. Oh, absolutely. First, there was the fact that a lot of the colonial enterprise was through education. So the traditional methods of education, which relied heavily on folk tales and proverbs, on participation in community storytelling, just fundamentally changed. But then there is also the fact that things started getting documented. So the idea of the original version came into play. Meanwhile, in most communities, there was orthodox, but there was also flexibility to adapt stories to meet different needs, and so that was an impact as well. But then there was also the kinds of stories being told started changing. For example, I believe personally that a lot of the trickster tales that emphasize knowing how to game the system to get an advantage, and not always in the healthiest of ways, emerge from just the chaos that colonization caused. The sense of, well, we have lost complete control of our access to our resources. So, what can I do to make sure that me and mine are always set, even if it means that other people are at a disadvantage? The gendered out playing out of these stories, how who ends up with more, who ends up with less, and how that plays out on the gender field. That is also part of that, because with colonization came almost an entrenchment of patriarchy. It's not to say there was no patriarchy on the African continent before colonization arrived, but in many ways colonization entrenched patriarchy, and that affected how women were portrayed in stories in many ways. That affected how men were portrayed, how women were portrayed, and that's a cascading effect that we still see, that affected how spirituality was perceived. So if you have one of the things I talk about is in the book, is where, because the supreme being of a certain people, the Sothwa, I believe, there was one statement about how the supreme being inhabits the depths, and that simple statement caused someone to translate that supreme being and set them as equal to the devil in Christian mythology because of the depths. And what that meant simply was that this supreme being is everywhere at all times, is immanent. And so just a slight twist of a phrase, and suddenly everything is different, everything has changed. So there was definitely an impact there. But fortunately, we are finding that there is pushback against many of these narratives now, and this book is part of that pushback to say, hey, these are things that have been taken for granted for long, and this understanding is almost entrenched, but there's another way of looking at it, which, might tell a different story. Right. That is another really great question. I'm glad you asked that because that was one of the things I saw and I was like, this is interesting, fascinating. Because the idea that the high god withdraws, one of the purposes for this is to say, okay, I don't want my unlimited power in the hands of human beings who may abuse it. And I thought that was just fascinating. But then what that does is it forces people to be in relationship with each other. Because if your well being is dependent on how you treat each other, how you work with the nature spirits around you, how you remember your ancestors, then it forces you to pay attention. And I think that is the one of the best things that African philosophies and spiritualities have to offer the world. Because sometimes, and you will see this in other world religions that have the higher planes of being, is that people get caught up there and forget that there is a down here, there is a relationship that you have with other people, that you have with the world around you that needs tending. And so you get this idea that, okay, if I'm okay with this, that vertical relationship is okay, the horizontal relationships don't matter. And African spirituality kind of, pops that bottle a little bit. But of course, that's changing because spirituality is not a static thing. And one of the key aspects of African spirituality is that it adapts to what is around it. It gets, takes information that's useful and changes. And that could be in a positive direction or in a negative direction. And so you'll find that that's a shifting. But I think, as you pointed out, that was something really that made me go, wow, that's amazing. The idea that the supreme being says, hey, I have given you all this knowledge, all this power, all this sense of, okay, this is what is possible. I've given you instructions to treat each other right. I'm going to take a step back and leave you to figure out how to be human beings. And I'm here. I'm going to help. I'm going to give you a way to summon me if you need my help. But I'm going to trust that you have the capacity, the intelligence, the love in your heart to deal fairly with each other. I think that is just absolutely beautiful. That comes back to the issue of what do these stories serve? And so I think that as long as we have a viable way of archiving, we're going to be okay, because storytelling is an evolving form. It has the liberty to change and adapt itself to reality. That is, especially when you talk about African storytelling, that is core. That is a core aspect of it. But you are right. What narrative is being pushed could be used to drive different agendas, and that has happened quite a lot. And so I think that as long as we have viable ways to archive stories and be able to see how these stories have changed over time and what might be the intention of a certain narrative being pushed at a point in time, I think we're going to be okay. Now, if we don't have that means of archiving, and that means of archiving is not in the hands of people who understand what is going on, we might have issues. And that comes from the experience of seeing and having to kind of tweak the narrative in a lot of folklore that was documented by missionaries, for example, who are coming at things from the Christian Victorian era understanding of how things should be. So it's a fine line. As long as there is archiving, then storytelling can change and adapt, even with AI, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but I don't think it's going away anytime soon. But as long as we have, the AI can say what it wants, but as long as we have the archival information that AI is mining to say what it has to say, I think we're going to be okay. I would say read it, enjoy it. Um, if you find that it's helping you understand the world better and African people better, that was my most fervent wish for this. And hey, if you think it's worthwhile, let me know how you think on social media with a review. If there is anything you disagree with, please, please, please let me know and we can have a conversation. And you know that it's the knowledge, it's the learning process. But above all, I really just want you to, or I hope that you enjoy the book as much as possible. My gosh, I have 1,000 tabs open in my mind, so that's not a question I can really answer right now. But hey, if you subscribe to the Mythological Africans
Yeah.
platform on Substack, then you will definitely be in touch with what I'm working on. Thank you
Cool.
so much for hosting me. Thanks for having me. Thank you to everyone who participated.